Okay, welcome then. Yeah, my name's Conall. Colin, Jesus, that's a bad start to that. My name is Colin. There's Conall Laverty joining with me, and we were expecting David Pollard, but he's probably asleep. So what we were coming to do is, between the three of us, we started an open sourced ventilator response project in March of this year. And what we're going to do is just have a little chat and a discussion about that for the next little while. A very kind of informal, let's say, slide deck enhanced conversation, let's say. So if anyone has any questions, put them into the chat and we'll see how we get on. So they are the three of us, David, Conall, and myself. So Conall, if you want to do a quick little introduction to yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Conall Laverty. I'm the founder and CEO of a tech company here in Ireland called Wire. So what we do is we specialize in helping property operators monitor occupancy, air quality, and energy. So my expertise would be more on the, I guess, the software and the electronics side, and that's where I kind of played in a little bit on the ventilator project, along with kind of helping the, I guess, the core piece in the community. So yeah, I'm an engineer by trade. I love building things. I've been to Maker Faire Rome before. It was a lot of fun. So yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing our story with everyone today.
Thank you very much. For David Pollard, who is currently missing, he is a innovation projects manager and works in the field of innovation. He's an innovation lecturer and researcher and academic, and he works mainly in the field of disability and technology inclusion for people with disabilities. And then myself, I am an engineer as well. I am a mechanical engineer and work doing R&D projects out of a university in Dublin, and have been exposed to open source hardware via open source prosthetic hands, prosthetic limbs, and 3D printing systems. So it jumped ahead. So early March this year, the world was dove into COVID and madness. So it was about the 15th or 16th of March when it really started to take shape here in Ireland. And, you know, the world forever changed, and the world went into justified panic, looking for access to medical technology, medical supplies, healthcare supplies, accessories, that sort of stuff. So that then was a prompt for an awful lot of people around the world to react. That the coronavirus then implemented lockdown procedures around the world. And at about that stage in March, all of our universities and schools had closed, and then businesses started to close. So we were in a situation where most people were working from home. An awful lot of people had extra time they were looking to contribute, and then an awful lot of people in the technology space used, like, based on their usual kind of reactionary approach, said, we can do something with this. Let's kind of try and get something together and make a move to develop something to help the COVID situation. So happenstance is the seed of most of these great projects. So very early on, I had a friend of mine link me into a Facebook group from a group called Open Source Medical Supplies, which was a Facebook group that was spun up by a guy in Los Angeles called Guy Cavalcanti. And it was, he put together an informal group looking at building open source responses to healthcare emergencies. And at that stage, they were looking at ventilators. So I joined that group, having had a bit of experience in 3D printing, remote development projects, and 3D printed prosthetics, and jumped on board and helped them promote it. So via a tweet, like most modern things that happen via Twitter these days. So a tweet, I'd put a call out via a tweet to say, I joined this group. We need some more help to look at open source ventilators. What could we do? And that tweet echoed a tweet sent by Conall, I think a couple of days later or the same day or something along them lines, where he was saying, yeah, well, what were you thinking at that stage?
Sorry, I'm muted there. Yeah, so it was kind of a similar thing that I was kind of noticing as Colin. There was, I guess, a lot of, everyone was kind of in a panic mode across the world. No one was really, certainly in the Western world, like no one had really come across this within recent times. You know, everyone talks about the Spanish flu of 1918, and I guess with the ability to communicate the way we can today, and the resources that we have, I guess looking at problems like this was a lot more, I guess, accessible and easier to kind of look into. So I just kind of put it out there to see what the appetite was, or what even the necessity was, because it's just like a typical whenever you look at this, if you were to distill this down to a typical startup, what is there what getting a good understanding of the problem, getting the market, all of that, and then looking towards a solution is exactly the way I was thinking about it. And personally, like when in times of crisis, I like to build. Certainly, I like to help others, and it's even to a point that therapeutic almost to help focus on things like this while the world is kind of on fire. But yeah, this for me, this was just kind of put out there to see what was going on, and then yeah, things kind of escalated pretty quickly, as Colin is I'm sure is going to tell you in a minute. It definitely went beyond one retweet and 19 likes.
Yeah. So exactly. So that kind of happened. We connected it via that way, and happenstance as it is. We had then formed a WhatsApp group to kind of focus on it that way. So I think there was about 20 odd people, I think, if I remember.
Yeah.
About that in the original WhatsApp group. And funny enough, most of them, nearly all of them, were startup people you and I both knew from the startup ecosystem here in Dublin. Developers, designers, marketing people, researchers, company CEOs, tech founders. So I think we all had that same sort of driven response to, here is a problem, let's see, can we do something about it kind of together?
Yes.
And we kind of did. We connected via that, and it unearthed an awful lot of interest here in Ireland. So we then decided at that stage, I think, to focus our efforts locally in Ireland, and saying it was great working on these large kind of Facebook-led projects, which was brilliant, but we needed our own sort of localized version with our own community so we could react quicker. You know, we could move faster, we could enable some of our local supports, and we could work with our local kind of healthcare service and provider and that sort of stuff. So that then facilitated the setting up of these groups. First of all, it was set up as Open Source Ventilator Ireland, and that we set that up to look at developing these open source ventilator systems. As time progressed, that expanded and then morphed into a group called Team OSV, which was Team Open Source Volunteers. And it was encompassing ventilators and any other kind of requirement for COVID at that time in the healthcare related space. Face shields, education material, tracking, delivery, that sort of stuff, anything and kind of everything. So from an innocuous tweet and then an innocuous WhatsApp message, this group kind of emerged from it, and it emerged at a pace none of us were expecting. So I remember somebody saying, okay, I can't remember, Colin, can you remember who said it, that we'd set up an enterprise level organization by accident overnight?
Yeah. I think like when we kind of brought things locally, as Colin was saying, suddenly, like a lot of kind of top people in Ireland and then Europe and then the world, everyone started to jump in, and the message very much amplified very, very quickly. And I think part of the reason, and Colin, so I'm sure, going to go into this more in the later slides, was if you look at the startup analogy I gave this previously, we were totally focused on product, and that was, I guess, what was kind of, I guess, product and community. Sorry. So we were focused on those two things, and that's why this kind of grew the way it did. That's why everyone jumped on board. That's why we got a lot of immediate attention, because people started to realize, okay, no, maybe this is kind of one of the core collectives that are actually maybe going to solve this problem.
Yeah, exactly. The core problem kind of focus, like, you know, is from the kind of, again, to reference the startup analogy, you and I both have been, you know, multiple time startup founders as well. Very rarely do we get presented with a very, very, very clear problem and then an impetus to develop a solution for it. So the combination of startup founders and then engineers is kind of like, we can build something. Let's jump into the build. Like, there's no validation at the early
stage.
But
also demand that wasn't there, right? So that was a big thing as well. So you're going from 2, 3, 4 weeks previous. No, we wouldn't have got 10 people to sign up. But suddenly we weren't even trying to market, and you know, thousands and thousands were jumping on board.
Exactly. Yeah. So as you can see, the growth rate in it was crazy. So what we did at that stage, because so many people were interested, and at that stage, I think there was probably a week or two where it was the only technology, one of the only technology fields of interest in the world at that stage. So it kind of exploded. So we had an open expression of interest gate on our website. And as you see, I think in the space of a week, we had like 4,200 people express interest or something. So it exploded rapidly. So that was a great thing, but also a difficult thing, because operationally and logistically, it got difficult even being able to run it. So in the end, what it ended up with, the final figure settled on, in total, there were 6,063 people had expressed interest and willingness to help, like in the space of like 2 weeks or 3 weeks, something crazy. That will then spread cover the majority of the world, 155 different countries in effect. That then translated, due to personal reasons or life reasons or people's availability, to just under 4,000 active members on the Slack channels that we'd set up. And then it presented just under 100,000 messages over the course of a couple of months. So I have a few more. I'll talk a little bit more details about that later on. But yeah, as you can see, it grew super quickly to cover the large majority of the world. And we had people from every race, religion, background, field, education level, everything. Everyone joined, everyone. It showed you how many people wanted to help the global kind of COVID fight, and from the different kind of backgrounds and areas that they could all help and contribute into it. So this was the image for a global spread, and I like to show it because Greenland annoys me so much on that image. Like, it's a big deal. So if anyone knows anyone in Greenland, let us know so we can kind of fill out that Greenland gap. So as you can see, very, very quickly, it was a global problem. This is what happens when it's a global problem that affects everyone. You had huge amounts of engagement from nearly every country in the world you could possibly imagine. People that wanted to help, people that wanted to help locally, and people that wanted to help internationally together. So, and then the only way we could manage that, and again, back to the startup roots, was via Slack. So I remember at the very, very early stages, the CEO of Slack, Stuart Butterfield, and all of his Slack team were super, helpful and, very generous to us in giving us access to whatever we needed in response to COVID. So we'd set up Slack, and we had active Slack channels. So like any kind of tech development team, we focused on Slack. We put our people into Slack as a community for them to develop actively. And what happened then, there was smaller little breakout communities formed in countries or regions or fields to operate externally, and they fed their information back into the Slack channel kind of going forward. And for what is a very basic slide, but what we decided to do was it needed some form of bounding condition. So I remember at the early stages, we didn't really know what we were doing, and nobody did. We wanted to make a medical device, but it was highly complicated. We had thousands of people in different fields and time zones and backgrounds all trying to work together towards the one goal. And that's kind of difficult. So I remember what we did is we worked very closely with the guys in Open Lung in Canada, and I'll talk a little bit more about them in a minute. And what we did is we set up some initial boundary conditions. We needed something to operate under. We needed a design spec or a goal to work towards. So these were the ones we operated under. What we were trying to do is develop what at that stage was called the field emergency ventilator, so a very low cost ventilator system to support medical practitioners around the world. We wanted to look at the development of other frontline needs and requirements, so PPE, applications, medical tools, things like that. One of the most important things we focused on was that safety is paramount. Safety was the utmost goal for these things. These are medical devices. So the concepts we were trying to design were designed to reduce harm and risk of death. So potentially we would not share or support the development of potentially unsafe devices. And our focus was medical validation. Medicine and the medical professionals had to tell us these were safe and certified before anything happened with them. We tried to source supplies, materials, and support locally wherever we possibly could. We wanted to try and make our designs as validated as possible, and the validation processes would be well documented and transparent and made available to the health services that might want to use them. And then we decided we'd disseminate via internet. So our website, Gitlab, and online social media. So we wanted to make safe, medically and expert-led interventions that could be well documented and traced to provide to the COVID emergency, and then with good valid documentation behind them if they were to continue beyond that kind of phase. And like I remember, I'm sure you can relate then, Conall, is like at this stage, nobody knew what they were doing. No group globally knew what they were doing. No open source project knew what they were doing. And there was very little in the way of guidance because the medical profession was trying to deal with this impending COVID apocalypse, and they didn't know how to deal with open source.
Yeah, and like the thing is, so between myself, Colin, and David, we had built exactly 0 ventilators before. So there, but I guess that's not like any any kind of open source challenge. It's a very common thing in the world of open source. They jump in and try things and break things and hopefully end up making things. And it was kind of like I guess some of the differences were kind of some of the things that Colin's just mentioned here, whereby we had to take extra things into consideration. So we couldn't just, put things up there and see what happened. There had to be an element of guidance. That's why we had the expression of interest form and stuff previously. That wasn't intended to be some sort of gate to keep people out. That was so we could actually create a really heavily structured community to then help to solve each of the unique problems that we would be facing around kind of mechanical engineering, electronics engineering, the safety, the regulations, and the different regulations for each country and territory that we would be looking at. And so bringing everyone in and I guess having as much of a conversation as possible was so key. So and that's that. I really, like, as Colin, I'm sure we'll touch on later on, like some of our conversations even with regulators have really made them sit back down again and look at their own processes, because they're starting to realize, okay, well, actually, there are maybe better ways to build medical devices where you don't have to spend 10 years, but trying to build something, and then whenever it comes out, the technology is inadequate. If you do kind of go for these kind of community approach with, I guess, a sparkle of enterprise at the end, maybe, then you can actually kind of create a better product, and you're also able to create something that then can be utilized and fulfilled in kind of developing nations, not just developed nations.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's safety and delivery of good product was our paramount kind of goal from throughout the project, and we focused on that kind of as we did. So from the ventilator perspective, this was our kind of laser focus from the very beginning. It became quite clear that the core functionality of any of these open source ventilator systems was going to be this bag valve mask. And a lot of people questioned it at the time. And if you have a look in the open source ventilator field, an awful lot of projects and people came to focus on exactly this, using this bag valve mask as the core to their actual designs and their products. And the reason was it's super widely available. It's very, very common in all healthcare scenarios. It's very well understood. It's certified for numerous kind of uses, and it's safe and familiar. So this is a kind of benchmark linchpin for this sort of work. Based around this is a key to what you would progress with kind of going forward.
Yeah, and on the Ambu bag, like some of the other reasons for it is that it is fully medically approved device, and to, I guess, use typical kind of maker-esque techniques to try to simulate or kind of create a version of this would be very, very difficult to make it to the standards that are needed for someone to be able to actually, I guess, use it as a direct inhalation or exhalation device. There could be a lot of issues. So focusing on, I guess, the mechanical structure around that and the mimicking of the human actions was a much more manageable project or approach.
Yeah, exactly. So that's exactly what happened. So we worked early on when we went looking at the earliest stages for who is developing the leading designs for these Ambu bag squeezer systems. Open lung at that stage. So a guy called Trevor Small in Canada was leading the way in these kind of simple, pared down, functional design concepts. And I was lucky enough to have known Trevor from working with him in the past and knew how good he was. And then Trevor and a friend of his, Andrew Finkel, started the Open Lung project. And that was them distributing and developing these concepts, early stage concepts for open source medical ventilators. And they distributed them via their own website and their GitHub, their GitLab, and it basically exploded from there on in. We'd identified who was making the best open source designs. We rolled in behind those guys to help them with community support and build out the community and provide information from their community into their developmental activities. And it kind of exploded from there. And as you want to check them out, openlung.org, you can see all of the work they kind of did. And the central core point to how they operated was around GitLab. Now, I am not a coder, so Gits were not something I was hugely familiar with when we started, but it actually kind of worked, So they use GitLab for hosting all of the projects and the inspired projects, the files, the design files, the iterative project branches. Conall, you might be able to talk more about that because you know more about it than I do.
Yeah, and so if I'm honest, it's my first GitLab experience. I've worked on hundreds of projects on GitHub, but yeah, Git's a Git. Arguably, when it comes to the core pieces of functionality, But this was a bit of a challenge as well. So the challenge really there was versioning on software can be pretty easy to do, but kind of sometimes versioning on hardware can be a little bit more difficult because of the way, I guess, the files are created, they're shared, and they're structured. But what we found from having this approach of having the GitLab set up and allowing people to I guess directly feed into it was that we were able to have that core project, but also I think we had it in 15 different languages constantly being translated, so that we were, again, as I was saying earlier, kind of making sure everyone, or as many people as possible, were able to access the conversation and be able to feed in their thoughts in their native language, which would then they'd be able to, I guess, have the strongest viewpoint through.
Yeah, it was like I thought it was great. You know what I mean? For Git in particular, that's designed for coding-based projects, it adapted, yeah, relatively well to these hardware-based ones and gave you an indication of how you could do these mass pull requests and, you know, issues and error updates for hardware in the future. So like, I definitely think it is a brand new tool to be used for open hardware development in that case, definitely. So yeah, working with the guys then. Yeah, so the results then. So what ended up happening from the ventilator arm over the course of the period was, I think the final number was 15 different ventilator concepts, and they were evolutionary. You could see from very, very simple ones on the top right to way more complicated versions as the needs evolved and as the requirements evolved and as the hardware that people wanted kind of evolved as the project wanted. But like, from a hardware perspective, Conall, I'm sure you'd agree, I've never seen hardware iterate as quickly as it did in this kind of project. It was multiple teams in multiple locations, taking multiple concepts and constantly learning from updates and feedback. And it was madness. Like, to do 17 concepts, that was like 2 months, wasn't it? Like,
yeah, it was. I think it was even more than 17, because each of the 17 or whatever number it was had iterations of them too. So some of them, I think even one of them had 10 different versions. So you could be easily into the hundreds if you kind of distilled every kind of major or minor revision that was published. But what we found though from this was that as we got further and further down that path, and you'll even see from some of the designs that are here, you'll see it becomes more and more complex. So we did realize, okay, this isn't just a matter of punching a bag. That approach is probably going to kill people, which is kind of the anti-mission statement here. So we then realized that, okay, we can build these things, but then we have to make sure we've got the reliability, and we've got to make sure we have an incredible control on the bag itself, and then we've got to make sure that it's actually makeable, because that was one of the key things here as well, from the start though, that we could create an incredible design and the Tango work perfectly, but if people can't build it, or people or say they have to get complex PCBs designed maybe or something, then it really is not as approachable. And having all of those factors in consideration the whole time, was super important and constantly fed into the design.
Yeah, and yeah, that whole process was kind of fascinating to see, as all of the people that were working on it started to realize this was a way more complicated process than anyone had thought. And then they were working on integrating the complexities that are needed for this to run properly in a kind of healthcare provision scenario. And as you can see it in the design, super simple, then more complicated gear sets, pulleys, like arms, vacuum chambers. There was lots of concepts very quickly iterated, and it was evolutionary. An awful lot of these were made redundant very, very quickly, and people were able to move on and adapt to other solutions. So it was a really super fast, iterative kind of developmental process from a hardware perspective. So that was all facilitated via that Slack channel, and the Slack channel for the ventilator arm had 36 public channels that were running at the time. They had, at its peak, it was 2,508 active members, which was a peak of like 785 active daily users at one stage. They generated just under 55,000 odd messages. And then the bit I liked the most was they transferred about 9 gigabytes of data between each other. So people in this Slack was the intermediary. It was the intermediary channel for people to share concepts, designs, videos, data, that sort of stuff. It was yeah, it was amazing to see the pace. I know we couldn't keep up with the pace of development and work that was on there, but that was the point. People could set their own groups, work away, and feed in as we developed.
Yeah, and it's credible that much data, I guess, went between people, considering the GitLab was, I guess, the core repository for this project anyway. So yeah, quite something that people were still like sharing ideas, code bases, kind of design files and everything through the Slack channel. And so it's really, I guess, showing the power of having something that is, I guess, totally accessible to all people, so that they can make their ideas heard.
Yeah, and that's a good point. There was multiple layers to how this project operated. There was the open Slack channel, and acted as like the community square, let's say, where everyone would come in and say, "I have this idea. Look what I'm working on." The Git then was like the storage repository where you put your files up when they were ready, or when you posted your results or your iterative feedback. And then there was lots of other little breakout groups. I know there was WhatsApp calls, there was Zoom calls. People formed their own little groups, with the Slack being the central channel where all of those groups interacted with each other. And we also had shared channels with other group projects that were trying to do the same thing. We had a shared channel with the group in Oxford that was making a ventilator there. We had a shared channel with the Helpful Engineering group. So this response and the open response to COVID really showed the benefit of open sharing of information and the speed you can get when you actually embrace it and do it kind of that way. So in the ventilator arm as well, we did have notification and support from a significant number of large organizations and small ones. But, is at the earliest of stages, we're thinking this was an idea we had over WhatsApp, and we put people together on the internet, and we were having regular design updates and calls with the lead engineering teams from companies like Ford and Amazon and PCH. We were in direct communication on a couple of times with groups and panels from the World Health Organization as COVID response. We were dealing directly with the Irish healthcare provider, the HSE. And then we had external support and offers of support from what are some of the largest companies in the world, which really showed at that stage, these large organizations realized that the response for these ventilators was coming from the open source community, and they were willing to support. And I know you'll agree then, Conall, the support we got for them like amazed us on a daily basis.
Yeah, and there's even more organizations on this. Like these are the ones who kind of got really embedded, I guess. And we were kind of overwhelmed by the offers of corporate and commercial support, which was incredible. Because again, for us, it really helped to solidify, I guess, the trust in the project. So that was one of the things that we wanted to make sure as well, and that's why we were very transparent and communicative. We wanted this to be, I guess, the project that people could kind of get behind and really start to push, because we weren't out there trying to raise financing or anything like that, because money was not the problem with this project. Money was not the problem with any of the kind of open source ventilator projects in the world. At the end of the day, if you had a design and it worked and it was definitely needed, governments, private individuals, high net worths, whoever, were going to give money to this. And so, but that said, when it came to the technical aspects, the regulatory aspects, the attaining components or software licenses or whatever, these kind of organizations were paramount to, I guess, helping to upscale the project.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, as Colin said, this was only a small selection of some of the ones we worked with. We worked most closely with these. And then as well as the large ones, we had so much support from small businesses as well, and smaller companies, from manufacturing support to material support to equipment and testing support. There were probably thousands of organizations and companies around the world that donated their time and their expertise and their effort to helping not only us at the core of it, but also all of the fringe projects that were associated with us. There was huge amounts of support given from all of these local companies. And it showed you that like the communities came together to help support and develop these sorts of projects and ideas into the future. So that was a ventilator arm in that case. But very, very quickly, it became clear there were significant amounts of other requirements. So very early on, two of our original kind of founders of the project and all with us, Roisin Lyons and Gillian Berry, decided to get together. And what they'd said was they'd utilize the connections they had to frontline healthcare staff and try and identify the other problems that were needed beyond ventilators. So they'd set up another channel called OSV Extended, or OSVX, and they were working away on these sorts of other COVID-related projects. So face shields, laundry improvement processes, face masks, isolation gowns, decontamination for floor trays, apps to support healthcare, hands-free doors, and education content. So anything that wasn't a ventilator went under the banner of OSVX, and they did amazing kind of work as well developing it. We very quickly span up their own Slack channel as well, and they had 42 public channels. They had an active peak of 1,418 members with a daily peak of 235. They generated nearly as many messages as we did, 44,415, and transferred about 4 gigabytes of data between themselves as well. So, they worked exceedingly well on the projects that weren't ventilators, things that were needed more immediately than the ventilators were, and like things that could be like achieved much easier. So that channel was running, and they partnered again, had excellent partners and support. So they manufactured things like this. Information was a huge problem. So calls for PPE, there was PPE shortages everywhere. So they created content and material to support calls for PPE here in Ireland and all other countries around the world as well, asking people to donate what they had and providing a connected platform, along with COVID Community Response Ireland and other partners that worked on. Those guys built a logistics network and were able to locate and deliver PPE to people that needed it via a very cool delivery metric, which we'll talk about now in a minute. They also then created like kind of information pieces, community information pieces, and reviews of research, because we had an awful lot of researchers and academics on our teams as well. So they kind of took an effective review and were able to present clear and concise, non-biased information to people via engaging manners and metrics. One of their best outcomes was the education project. So they created a number of these really good educational images and logos for use around the world. So, people weren't sure how to deal with COVID, how to stay safe, how to wear face masks, how to wear their PPE properly, how to safely return home from work if you were a healthcare professional. So a great team was set up, and they worked away tirelessly on creating these very clear, concise, information-led documents and pieces to help people, convey this information in an easy, understandable, and like kind of non-linguistic way. So even if you didn't read English, there was non-English versions. There was, I think there was 8 or 9 different language versions, and then there was like no language versions. So again, great educational content, things that was needed immediately during this kind of COVID response. They then worked on other kind of lower quality, but also like maximum requirement type designs. So one of them was like low resource equipment. So things like paper shields, paper trays, paper face shields. When we were running out of materials, they looked at ways to create the materials needed to keep the healthcare system running. Again, more information, a clearer image of their face shield and their common mistakes when using face masks, very appealing, very interesting, very exciting. There was a whole other group working on building face shields, so low cost face shields. And as Conall mentioned as well, like all of our volunteers and all of the projects we worked with did this completely pro bono. They volunteered their time, equipment, and effort. The amount of effort and time that people contributed freely was amazing. And that was one of the core ethoses of all of our project. It was non-financial. We were trying to cope with an emergency. It wasn't a way for us to make money. It wasn't a way for us to facilitate other people to make money. This was an approach in which we were trying to react to a problem. So, we work with university groups, we worked with community spaces, we worked with companies to help refine, develop, and recommend optimized face shields or, eyeglasses. As you can see there was a whole R&D project run in a university in Dublin about making these advanced eyeglasses super cheaply and super low cost. So, there was a huge scope of things, and to their like forever long-lasting credit, the list of identified areas they created was amazing. So, that's one half of it you can see on the screen. Things like airway support, face mask alternatives, paper shields, manufacturing gowns, biohazard suits, guidance. They had a second one as well, hands-free doors, staff trackers, face mask straps, things that would help people combat kind of early stage COVID responses much quicker than the kind of traditional manufacturing approaches could actually do.
And I think that the other thing to say about this as well just is this also came from the demand of the core OSV group itself. So something we had, those numbers that Colin put up earlier of those thousands of people within that main group. But then, not everyone could be working on the same ventilator designs either. but then people really wanted to do things. So there was a huge appetite already there. So a lot of the members who kind of were already, I guess, integrated into their the core piece were very keen to create this stem and other stems, as you can see, and you'll find out more shortly.
Yeah, it was excellent. Yeah, there was lots of different things, and projects were running at different paces, at different speeds, with different levels of requirement. So we were trying to kind of create opportunities for people to find something they can contribute to. And then in order to support that, they created this really great phasing system to kind of graduate their products going forward in the OSVX side. You know, they identified ideation selections, they broke it up into individual stages. This was a plan that they were proposing to publish further on. There was an awful lot of structure built around how they dealt with these ideas. And then the third arm of the project was a group called Bravo Charlie Tango, and this was a biker gang. So this was set up by an amazing guy called Merv Colton. That's him there in the high-vis vest right in the middle. And Merv was part of a group, and he ran a Facebook page about bikers, a bikers photography group, if I remember rightly. And they couldn't move during COVID, and they said, we have hundreds of bikers around Ireland, as the country we are currently in now, and they had hundreds of bikers, and he said, we can do something. So Merv set up Bravo Charlie Tango, which was a biker delivery gang, and they ran amazingly well. So what they did was they were able to identify people that needed PPE or requirements. They were able to identify people that had excess stocks, and then they delivered them via their bikers. So there were hundreds, if not thousands, of bikers ferrying PPE from industry to hospitals to care homes, extra equipment. It was amazing how quickly they got it together, and they delivered thousands. They did thousands of individual delivery runs, you know, that spawned from this. And it was all Merv's brainchild, and he worked tirelessly to get it done. And he also then expanded. So as you can see there, they managed to commission hospital gowns, a prototype run of kind of open source hospital gowns, and get them delivered for testing in hospitals. So, you know, the ability and the flexibility that these guys in BCT run was staggeringly good. They could respond, I think, within minutes. The response time was down to minutes, and they managed to track, trace, and dispatch bikers to deliver requirements all around Ireland at the stage. And it was amazing how good they were. And then I think they had 900 members, voluntary members at the peak on their bikes. I think there was over 1,500 deliveries made to frontline staff. I'm not surprised if it's probably 2,000 plus now. And they were delivering PPE and other things. There was a real nice story where the bikers went, and a flower growing company donated flowers. They couldn't pick them. They had no market for them. So the bikers went out and picked the flowers and then delivered them to old folks' homes around Ireland. So it was not just PPE. It was nice things that kept people's spirit up and positive. And the feedback was excellent to see community members just come together and source and deliver requirements to hospitals in their time of need was amazing to see. And like, all credit to Merv and his dispatch crew and all of their volunteers for the like staggering kind of work that they did over the period. So what we then tried to do is, it needed a place to live. So it all lived on our kind of website. So we'd set up a website, Team OSV, and that was meant to be the central point to connect all of the different elements, to connect the Ventilator, to connect the OSVX project, to connect the Bikers project, just act as a central point for us to kind of host some information, but here is to act as the conduit. Via this website, you could get connected to the Gitlab, you could get connected to some of the support groups, you could get connected to the Slack channel, you could get connected to the places you needed it kind of going forward. And all of this work is led by volunteers. We had amazing volunteers, you know, some like all credit. I can't say enough about them. We couldn't name them all because there was thousands of them entirely, but all of it was volunteer-led work. People worked tirelessly, you know, for no money, because there was no money involved. It was something we were quite keen on keeping non-financial for the reasons Conall talked about earlier on. So yeah, like, we want to, both of us and everybody, thank all of those amazing volunteers for all the effort and time and work they put in with us.
Absolutely.
So kind of on the review thing, the issue then was we were just one group in a group of many. So, you know, there was lots of people doing many of similar work kind of going forward. So to just list a few, there was Joseph Prussia and the Prussia's company were leading some of the early face mask designs, and they produced hundreds of thousands of face masks and freely shared the designs online. So, you know, the 3D printing community came behind this idea hugely. there was the very popular story of the engineers in Italy who were 3D printing the ventilator splitting devices and the air valve devices. Quite controversial with legal cases potentially involved. But, you know, these guys just embraced open source and went to solve a local problem to help people in their time of need. You know, there was groups like Helpful Engineering that set up a huge COVID response, and they were looking at open source technology solutions with active Slack channels, and they did an awful lot of the same kind of interventions we did, mainly focused in the US. There was the original open source ventilator group we worked with became Open Source Medical Supplies, and they have a website, and they produced, like you can see, 50 million pieces of PPE and equipment in the US alone, which was like staggering the volumes they managed to create and produce. And then like local as well, there was great local projects. So there's a co-working space in Cork called Bench Space here in Ireland that started a project making face shields for frontline staff that were supported by our Irish Army. There was research groups in locations around the world, you know, like UCD and Trinity and DCU. All of our local universities embraced it and started to manufacture these projects as well. So it really was a community-led kind of effort. One of the community responses that helped us an awful lot was this list here created by Robert Reid. And what he did was ranking and grading the development of open source ventilators around the world. So there was more than 130 open source ventilator projects released over the kind of COVID response period, let's say. And support like this, he evaluated them all for on the metrics you can see. How open is the project? How buildable is it? What testing is there? How reliable is it? And this was a great guide to measure and track who you should work with, who's leading, and like who can you take inspiration from going forward. So support like this, lots of people supported in lots of very diverse and different kind of ways. So all of this basically was a huge project in trying to crowdsource an emergency humanitarian open source hardware development project, which was like a crazy learning process for all of us involved. And it threw up a whole host of different ideas and concepts and kind of problems as well. So, you know, it's like a hackathon development process, but imagine trying to do that without any of the structure and without any of the formality. So that's basically what was undertaken at that kind of time. And then it kind of spawned out. And I know a lot of our volunteers worked and supported on the European Union's EU versus virus challenge and many, many others since then. So an awful lot of people that are volunteers kind of cut their teeth in the open source ventilator project and then went on to embrace and adapt more open source projects going forward into the future. But this is kind of the ending section is there were problems. There were lots of problems, and I think we'll be the first to notice them, both in what we were trying to do, how we did it, how it ran, how it operated. And I think we just kind of have a chat about them going forward. So one of them is ethics and morality. So I remember, you know, our core discussion group spent many a time talking about how we should do this ethically. You know, as Conall mentioned, finance perspective, we did not take any financing at all. We did not do a crowdfund. We turned down external financing and a significant amount because, as Colin said earlier on, if we had an idea that was validated, was safe and worked, we would have no problem raising the funding for it. And we viewed early stage fundraising was going to be a distraction. We'd spend more time raising money than doing actual work. And what would happen, which actually happened for an awful lot, if not all of the projects, where there was no need at the end, or the machines didn't work, or they weren't able to do what they were designed to do. You then had a huge financial burden that you then had to try and redistribute and sort. So we avoided that.
Yeah, because one of the things we saw in some people who had raised money that, you know, a week, 2 weeks later, people were kind of writing messages and comments and even putting posts online going, where are the ventilators that you promised me? I gave you kind of, you know, €100 or €1,000, you know, whatever it was. So the expectation became very different. Would have been very different for other orgs, and would have been very distracting from the actual community building and problem solving process itself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we wanted to just focus on the problem and fix the problem and not worry about finance or marketing or any of that sort of stuff. So there was lots of conversations about it. You have to decide if what you're making is safe, if it's viable. You know, we had discussions about not releasing 100% complete plans because we couldn't trust they were be built properly. We looked at like identifying manufacturing partners that had experience locally to get in and develop and kind of create these things going forward. And from the very core, what we wanted to focus on a clinically led, medically led response. So I know we had an awful lot of frontline medical professionals and doctors in our core team that were our medical support. Like Keith Kennedy being the main one. Dr. Keith Kennedy, we kind of wrecked his head constantly as he was reviewing our medical support, and he was our kind of medical touchstone for how we were going to develop these things safely. So having a core focus like a medically led approach is very, very important, and kept us on the kind of straight and narrow. Then one of the issues we faced was hierarchy and organization. So everyone was a volunteer in what we did. There was thousands of volunteers, different stages, different levels of experience, different conversations happening. But it wasn't a company. It wasn't designed to be a company. Nobody involved wanted it to become a company. But the lack of hierarchy and an organizational structure in what was such a quickly put together large scale project caused us loads of difficulties. So there were issues in that about who's directing what project flow for who's listening to what, who can represent the organization as a whole or a group, and what can they say and how do they say it. So in a response like that, building good structures and organizational structures is something that I'd focus on. If we were to ever do this again, I would focus an awful lot more on building those structures early on. But the reason we didn't was it was a reaction. We wanted to build these machines and create these interventions. And at the earliest of stages, building this hierarchical structure was just delaying us from doing that. So
luckily we had people like Noel Toolin, Andy Henry, who come in on the branding and messaging side, and even with, I guess, us trying to avoid that hierarchical organization piece, we were able to still align on I guess the narrative that we were telling, so that everyone was I guess singing from the same book, because that was extremely important, and also kind of vital to the growth that we saw as well, because the same message was being amplified rather than a million different variants.
Yeah, exactly. So like we had great support from, as you said, Noel and Andy on marketing and messaging and how we actually present a cohesive message. We had an awful lot of support from people like Dave Graham and Rosa Langhammer on online structures and how we run our Slack and how we moderate it.
Yeah.
And, like Rocha Ian and Jill running the OSVX channel. And we had huge amounts of support as well. It was an ad hoc organizational structure, but we could have done a probably better job in showing people what that actually looked like. But unfortunately, everyone was busy doing the actual thing. So, we could build a structure kind of afterwards. So that's one of those tips for the future. One of the most important ones is legislation and then legality. So we ran into this very, very regularly. We were trying to do something impossible, in effect. We were trying to develop a highly regulated, life-critical piece of healthcare equipment online without a company or structure or formality at an accelerated pace. So, normally to do something like this would take years and probably tens of millions of dollars in a company. And we were trying to do it without any of that. So we ran into issues with legality and structure and regulation. And that mainly came from compliance rules and requirements. So we had some excellent compliance people, and they did a huge amount of work on regulations and rules and certifications and safety. The problem came from the fact none of these projects had any higher level guidance. There was no real guidance letting people know what to work towards or what limits or regulations or policies to kind of meet. So to explain that, most of the world's projects were working on a specification for emergency ventilators for COVID that was released by the British Health Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Authority, the MHRA. So they released, which became the main guidance document for all of the ventilator designs in the world. They released the specification for rapidly manufactured ventilator systems. But a point of note is if you look at the published date and the update date, it was published on the 20th of March at the beginning of the COVID kind of European aspect of the COVID crisis. And then it was updated in the 28th of April. But that update was critical, and that update caused an awful lot of damage to the actual motivations and the projects going forward. And the reason was the initial specification was not designed correctly. The original specification that all the projects worked towards would not have resulted in fit for function hardware. They were too simple. They didn't have the features and supports that were required for integration properly. So most of the teams were working on poor specifications for nearly 2 months before the specs were updated. And the update in the specs took an awful lot of the viability out an awful lot of the projects. And then the need for these ventilators never really materialized. So governments cancelled orders. So that kind of then facilitated the slowdown of this open source medical kind of intervention at this stage. We talked a little bit about funding and the importance of it. And the big issue we faced with an awful lot of these projects was crowdfunding. And not our crowdfunding, was the requirements from other crowdfunding campaigns. So there was an awful lot of open source initiatives, ventilators and the likes, that went financial first. We're hardware people, we're startup people. We want to design a product to solve a problem, and we'll sort the finances of it later. An awful lot of other projects went to raise money and immediately. They did a crowd fund. They might have raised hundreds of thousands of euros, but there was no plan. There was, what were they going to do with it? And like, you know, having worked in startups before, as Conall has, you know, we have been the kind of gatekeepers to investors' money. So we know full well you spend it properly on with a plan that is useful and gives a return. So we kind of avoided crowdfunding, and many of the kind of startup initiatives or kind of open source initiatives around these ventilators, I would imagine, ran into significant crowdfunding and sourcing problems. And it was a hard thing to do, because I remember we had a quite significant voluntary donation offer from a very prominent person in the US startup space that we turned down because we didn't have a reason to take it. We didn't have a validated project yet. So, you know what I mean? It's...
Yeah. It was a bit of a weird moment, I guess, for all of these kind of like top people in the global tech community, who we won't name obviously, but who reached out and were like, "No, it's fine.
Yeah.
We don't need your money right now. We're focusing on, we're trying to build things, and we'll come back to you when we need it."
A very, very hard thing to do. Us in technology startups, when you're turning down investment from like the kings of the tech startup space, yeah, it's a strange feeling. But it was, I'm sure you agree, it was the perfect thing to do.
It was the right decision.
It was the right decision in the long run. And then everything we had in the development is now open. There's no requirements to everyone. We don't have any money to pay back, and we can share everything we develop kind of going forward. So yeah, regulation was the huge aspect of it as well. You know what I mean? And then as we find, as the project progressed in the earliest of stages, an awful lot of the healthcare sector and the healthcare leaders and kind of healthcare bodies around the world were very, very open to integrating these open source emergency solutions because they thought they needed them. You know, so the FDA in the US were very helpful. The medical regulators in an awful lot of European countries were very, very helpful. But as the pandemic progressed and it became clearer and clearer that there wouldn't be an overwhelming volume of ventilators required, and that the ventilators that would be required maybe aren't the best treatment plan for people with COVID, that then kind of reduced the support from these regulators. And to be truthful, I fully agree with it. You know, they're not going to get involved in something that they don't need to. So it's a complicated project. So regulation was a kind of issue. And then I think, like, to kind of finish off, I think the thing we could have done better at the beginning was planning. And, you know, but planning for, I know it's a difficult thing to do. We had to plan for a pandemic that the world didn't expect. So, and we planned for a response that we didn't think we were going to have to need. So, you know, unfortunately, it will happen again. These things will happen again. It could be an earthquake. It could be a tsunami. It'll probably be another infectious virus within the future. But this whole process has shown that open source in particular can have a big, huge part to play in these emergency responses. And that, proven from our own work and other people's work, that large industry and large governments have started now to take notice of the power that open source responses can have in these things. I think kind of going forward, what everyone needs to do is get connected a little bit better, join up together, make a plan, and like give some grounding or framework of a document to how people can respond in an open source manner to whatever the next issue or problem is going forward. So I think, yeah, that's kind of the end of our time there. You had David's logo for 5 minutes at the end, but for the rest of it, you had Conall and myself. So if we can be of any help, let us know and get in contact with us. And then thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, thank you very much, guys. And we're delighted to share this story with you today. And you can connect with Colin and myself on Twitter, LinkedIn, and David, of course, too. We got recent good news that he is alive, which is great. But yeah, it was quite a journey. And as Colin said, we hope that the learnings from this can help to help future frameworks for solving big issues in the years and decades to come.
Exactly. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Conall. And then I think if anyone has any questions, we've a couple of minutes, we can answer some questions if anyone has any questions. If you want to put them in the chat, or even you want to turn on your camera and ask us if you can. You might not be able to, but...
Oh, thank you, Sue.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so we're open if anyone has any questions to pop in the chat. Anyone can ask a question except for David Pollard. He's not allowed. He's barred. No, David, no.
Yes, no as in N-O, not K-N-O-W.
No, it doesn't look like it. If anyone doesn't have any questions, enjoy the rest of Maker Faire.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye.